The instructors announced the next stage of the survival curriculum with the same practiced calm that always made the alien cadets uneasy. The group had already endured temperature drops, food restrictions, and predator simulations, yet the announcement of something called the candle test sent a murmur through the ranks. The cadets knew the training planet's night cycle was notorious even by galactic standards. Once the sun dropped, the air turned unnaturally still, and the ground began to radiate a cold that seemed to drain the strength of anyone caught unprepared. The darkness itself behaved like a living creature, swallowing sound and movement until vision became nearly useless. Most alien species relied heavily on artificial illumination for night travel, and many had spent entire lifetimes avoiding unlit environments. The instructors understood this perfectly, which was why the assignment was delivered with such casual cruelty. Each cadet would receive one candle, not a lamp, not a glow stick, not a thermal torch, just a single wax candle, barely the length of a hand. The rule was simple: make it last until sunrise. The instructors said nothing more. There were no hidden guidelines and no clarifications. The silence after the announcement only increased the tension, because everyone knew the unspoken truth. Surviving the night with a fragile flame on this planet was nearly impossible. Aaron, the human trainee, accepted his candle without complaint. His posture was relaxed, and his expression remained as unreadable as always. Some cadets assumed he did not understand the gravity of the challenge, but others had observed him long enough to notice something different. He had survived previous trials with methods that unsettled the entire class. While others panicked, he studied. While others waited for instructions, he experimented. He had an instinctive understanding of danger, not from manuals, but from something deeper, something shaped by the brutal environments of his homeworld. To him, the candle was not a lifeline. It was a puzzle piece. As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, the instructors handed out the candles, and the alien cadets immediately formed small clusters to share ideas. A pair of insectoid cadets debated whether to ration the flame in short bursts or keep it burning steadily. A reptilian cadet wondered if the candle could be used as a heat source for her species' cold-sensitive body. One of the avian cadets had already broken his candle in half in a clumsy attempt to create two smaller flames and was now panicking because he had reduced both pieces to nearly useless slivers. Aaron moved away from the group and examined the terrain instead of the candle. The ground was a mixture of dust and brittle vegetation, neither of which held heat. That meant the night would be cold, very cold. The horizon revealed a scattered collection of low hills and depressions, and he knew from earlier reconnaissance runs that the valley floors collected heavier gases during the night, creating pockets of mist that could obscure movement and swallow sound. The darkness would not simply hide predators, it would distort the instincts of anyone trying to rely on hearing or scent. He held the candle up to the remaining daylight and turned it between his fingers. The wax was firm yet slightly pliable, suggesting it had been mixed with a stabilizing agent. The wick was tightly packed, designed to burn evenly rather than quickly. The instructors did not choose this model randomly. They wanted to see whether the cadets treated the candle as a fragile relic to preserve or as a tool to manipulate. Aaron understood that distinction immediately. When the last light faded and the training grounds slipped into the planet's unnerving night, most cadets lit their candles at once. A forest of tiny flames flickered uneasily across the campsite, each one struggling against the first slow gusts of cold wind. Some cadets cupped their hands around the flames, unwilling to let a single spark escape. Others huddled in groups, hoping that multiple candles burning together would create enough heat to outlast the night. But the wind pushed harder, and every flame trembled with each breath of icy air. Aaron did not light his candle. He kept it in his pocket as he crouched near a cluster of fallen branches scattered at the base of a cracked basalt outcrop. The branches were thin and brittle, yet resinous enough to burn. He snapped one and brought it to his nose, confirming the faint bitter scent that indicated flammable oils within the wood. He collected several branches, stacking them carefully while keeping his body angled to avoid blocking the sound of distant movement. Predators on this planet preferred to stalk from downwind, and the change in scent carried by the breeze gave him a good sense of direction. Behind him, one of the alien cadets cried out as her candle flickered violently and shrank to half its size. Another cadet cursed the wind, and a third insisted that the instructors had sabotaged the candles. The tension spread rapidly among the group. A single gust could end the entire assignment for any of them, yet the wind was growing stronger by the minute. The instructors watched from a distance, their silhouettes blending into the dark as if they were testing not only skill, but psychological endurance. Aaron ignored the noise. He examined the outcrop for crevices and found several narrow gaps where a flame could be shielded from direct wind. If he wanted to use the candle, he could melt wax into these crevices and form a controlled burn, but he was not ready to commit to that. Instead, he analyzed how the shadows moved, how the ground reflected the faint starlight, and how the cold intensified in waves rather than steadily. These small environmental cues were far more valuable than the candle itself. The candle was only the first step. The environment would determine everything else. One of the smaller cadets approached him, her voice trembling as she asked why he had not lit his candle yet. He only answered that darkness did not force him to panic. She did not understand, so she retreated, clutching her flickering flame like a failing heartbeat. Aaron felt the darkness settle deeper as the temperature dropped sharply. The air became still, and sound seemed to disappear. This was the true beginning of the trial. He finally took the candle out again, not to light it, but to break off a tiny flake of wax. He rolled it between his fingers, testing how easily it softened. Then he pressed the flake against a piece of bark to see how well it adhered. The candle was more valuable as a material than as a light source. That realization separated him from the others instantly. When the first distant howl echoed across the training ground, the cadets' fear became a tangible force. Some shields flickered, some flames died completely, but Aaron simply stood still, watching how the darkness shifted around the sound. He understood that the howl was not close. It only sounded close because this planet's valleys carried noise in strange ways. The instructors called this place a sensory trap for a reason. Aaron quietly pocketed his candle again. The test had already begun, but he was not planning on letting the instructors decide how far one candle could take him. He would decide that himself. The darkness settled fully over the training grounds by the time Aaron began moving away from the outcrop, and he advanced with a calm, deliberate pace that contrasted sharply with the frantic energy behind him. He could hear the alien cadets arguing in small clusters, their fear pushing them into poor decisions as they fought the cold and the oppressive silence. He did not turn back. His attention remained fixed on the terrain ahead, where the faintest traces of starlight reflected off mineral fragments scattered through the dust. These fragments offered just enough illumination for him to navigate without lighting anything. His night vision had already started adapting, and he kept his breathing controlled to avoid fogging his peripheral vision with warm air. He moved toward a shallow ridge he had noticed earlier in the day, recalling how certain plants had collected along the base of the slope. He needed fibrous material, something that could catch flame easily, but also hold shape long enough to serve as a foundation for more complex structures. The instructors had not forbidden gathering resources, which meant every piece of the environment remained part of the assignment. He crouched near a cluster of low plants with thin, papery leaves. He ran his fingers along the leaves, feeling their texture. They crumbled slightly but did not disintegrate, confirming they had a dry internal mesh ideal for fire lacing. He gently stripped several leaves, rolling them into tight bundles and tucking them into a pocket of his jacket. The wind shifted again, sending a current of colder air sweeping across the ridge, and with it came a faint metallic scent. Aaron paused. The scent meant mineral exposure, likely from the cracked stone formations near the deeper ravines. Mineral flakes from those formations often reacted when struck together, producing small sparks. He filed this information away, knowing sparks were critical for ignition without wasting wax. He descended the ridge carefully, glancing occasionally toward the horizon. He listened to the environment rather than relying on sight. Each small vibration in the ground told him where the gusts were landing and how the air pockets moved. Every shift in the temperature taught him the pattern of the night cycle that the instructors wanted him to understand through instinct rather than instruction. When he reached the ravine, he knelt near a pile of broken shale. His fingers brushed the surface lightly, gathering dust and tiny fragments. Some pieces broke cleanly with sharp angles, while others had a crystalline sheen that hinted at conductive properties. He selected a handful of flakes with smooth, reflective sides. He struck two gently, watching the faint spark appear and vanish instantly. It was not strong enough to ignite anything alone, but with the fibrous plant bundles he had collected, it would be effective. He pocketed the mineral flakes, then took a moment to study the ravine walls. The rock layers displayed streaks of deep red and pale gray. The red layers indicated oxidized minerals that would burn slowly when heated. If he could find a way to stack them properly, he could create a controlled ember that would last for hours. He continued exploring the ravine floor, moving deeper into the shadowed area where the wind weakened. The ground was softer here, suggesting buried organic material beneath the upper dust layer. He dug with his hands, scraping away loose soil until he reached fibrous roots. These roots were too moist to burn, but he could dry them easily if he built a sufficient heat pocket. He extracted several strands, twisting them into a coil. The coil would serve as a wick enhancer, allowing a flame to spread wider without consuming the candle wick itself. He wrapped the coil around a larger mineral flake to keep it in place. A rasping sound echoed faintly from above, causing him to freeze. He lifted his head and listened closely. The sound was not a predator's call. It was the vibration of shifting rock disturbed by the cooling air. He dismissed it and resumed collecting material. His movements remained fluid and economical. He did not rush, did not hesitate, and did not let his mind drift. He treated the environment as a vast resource field rather than a hostile threat. That perspective allowed him to see opportunities where the other cadets saw only danger. Once he had gathered enough material, he climbed out of the ravine, keeping himself angled to avoid slipping on the slick stone. At the top, he paused again. His eyes traced the distant flickers of candlelight where the other cadets struggled to protect their flames. Some lights were already gone. Others trembled wildly, barely holding against the wind. He silently noted which cadets were likely to fail and which ones might endure a little longer, but he did not dwell on it. His priority was preparation, not comparison. He turned north, heading toward a group of ancient tree stumps scattered across a small plateau. The stumps were remnants of a long-dead forest, petrified by centuries of mineral saturation. Their surfaces had become porous, and some sections absorbed moisture while others repelled it. He tapped a stump with his knuckles and heard a hollow echo. This stump had a cavity inside. He examined the bark-like exterior and found a natural slit along the side. With careful pressure, he pulled it open slightly, revealing a small chamber filled with powdery residue. He touched the residue with his fingertips and lifted it to his nose. The scent carried hints of resin and char. Perfect. This material could be used to extend flame longevity or thicken melted wax. He collected the residue in a small cloth pouch, making sure to avoid leaving sharp fragments inside that could tear the fabric. He then inspected the other stumps, searching for additional pockets of resin. One stump had a small seam filled with dark amber deposits. He pressed the seam with his thumb, feeling how slightly warm the resin remained from stored solar heat. He scraped some off with a shard of stone and added it to the pouch. Resin meant slow-burning fuel. Combined with the fibrous leaves and mineral flakes, it would allow him to produce multiple flames without losing control over any single source. As he stepped away from the plateau, the first signs of night mist began rising from the lower valleys. The mist moved slowly, creating rippling distortions across the terrain. He understood those distortions immediately. The air temperature differences could reveal wind direction and approaching movement long before sound carried. He watched the mist drift and marked how the trails curved. The pattern confirmed his earlier assumption. Predators would likely approach from the southeast tonight. That information dictated where he could safely set up any future light sources. He continued forward until he reached a collection of tall, dead grass. The stalks were rigid and dry, perfect for weaving into thin cords. He knelt and began stripping the outer layers methodically. Each cord he twisted became strong enough to tie structures together. When he had enough, he wound them into a compact bundle. He then examined the remaining grass stalks, selecting the thickest ones to use as reinforcement sticks. These would serve as frames for later constructs, allowing him to hang or elevate any lantern-like mechanism he created. The cold intensified as the night deepened. His breath emerged in thin clouds, yet he remained focused. He scanned the area once more, ensuring he had not overlooked any useful resource. Satisfied, he adjusted his pack and began walking back toward the outcrop, where he intended to build his first test structure. Every step carried purpose. Every material in his possession served a specific role. The instructors had provided one candle, but the planet had provided everything else, and he intended to use all of it. By the time he returned to the outcrop, the wind had calmed slightly, giving him a brief opportunity to begin crafting. He set the materials down carefully, arranging them in a layout that allowed him to see their potential combinations. He examined the candle again, holding it up to judge its density against the plant bundles and resin deposits. He could already imagine multiple configurations, each more efficient than the last. The night was far from over, but he had already gathered enough to build far more than a simple flame. Aaron spread the materials he had gathered across the flat stone surface at the base of the outcrop, arranging each piece with the quiet precision of someone who already understood what he intended to build. He did not rush. He studied every item in the dim starlight, letting his fingers trace the edges of mineral flakes, resin chunks, and fibrous plant bundles. The cold pressed in harder now, settling on his skin like a warning, yet he ignored it. He had enough information from the terrain to begin shaping his first construct. The instructors had tested the cadets with scarcity, but he had never viewed scarcity as an obstacle. Scarcity simply forced creativity to surface. He picked up the candle and examined the base, noting how tightly the wick had been pressed into the wax. The instructors likely believed the cadets would use the candle only as intended, but he saw immediately that the wax could be manipulated. He warmed the candle between his palms until the outer layer softened slightly, then scraped a thin ribbon from the side using one of the mineral flakes. The flake's sharp edge shaved the wax cleanly, and he collected the curled piece in his hand. He placed it on a flat stone and pressed it gently, testing how it behaved when flattened. The wax held shape perfectly. That meant he could use it as adhesive. Next, he selected several strips of the dry, fibrous leaves he had gathered earlier. He twisted them into a tight coil, allowing the natural mesh to bind together. He added a pinch of powder from the old stump residue, pressing it into the fibers to increase flammability. The coil felt light, but sturdy. This would serve as an inner ignition layer, something that could catch sparks quickly without consuming the candle wick. He placed the coil aside and reached for the sticks he had taken from the dead grass stalks. The thicker stalks bent slightly but did not crack when he tested them, making them ideal as structural supports. He arranged 3 sticks into a triangular frame and used the thin cords he had braided earlier to tie them securely at the ends. The result resembled a small hanging mount, stable enough to support a container or fuel pocket. He took more sticks and created a second frame, this time forming a square platform. He connected both frames together with cross ties, creating a skeleton that could hold a small lantern-like mechanism. Once satisfied, he reinforced the joints with softened wax, rubbing it into the fibers so it hardened upon contact with the cold air. The structure stiffened immediately, becoming sturdier than he anticipated. He then took a mineral flake with a broad, reflective surface and embedded it at the back of the frame. He secured it using more wax shavings, shaping them like wedges to keep the flake angled slightly forward. The flake's reflective sheen caught the faint starlight and amplified it subtly, confirming his suspicion that the mineral would direct any future flame outward. The structure now had the basic form of a primitive lantern reflector. He placed a small mound of resin in the center of the frame and gently pressed the fibrous coil into it, allowing the two materials to merge. The coil sank slightly into the resin, forming a shallow cup that could hold heat and release a steady burn. Now came the delicate part. He took the candle again and warmed its base until he could slide the wick out slightly. He did not remove it completely. Instead, he exposed just enough to draw a thin thread of wax-coated fiber loose. He stretched this thread carefully and broke it off, forming a tiny secondary wick. He inserted this wick deep into the resin-coated coil, anchoring it at an angle designed to channel flame along the resin without consuming it too quickly. He placed the candle aside again. The candle remained whole and usable, but the small extraction gave him an essential ignition tool inside the lantern frame. He then picked up 2 mineral flakes. He struck them together gently, creating a spark that jumped across the surface. He repeated the motion several times, increasing speed until he understood the exact force required for consistent sparks. Once confident, he positioned the lantern frame in front of him and held 1 flake inside the coil. With the other flake, he struck quickly, sending sparks into the resin pocket. On the 3rd attempt, the resin inhaled the spark, and a faint glow began expanding. The resin softened, darkened, then brightened with a low, sustained burn. The flame grew steadily, feeding from the coil and rising toward the reflective mineral surface behind it. Aaron watched the first handmade lantern come alive, its glow stable despite the cold wind. The frame shielded it from direct gusts, while the mineral reflector pushed the light forward in a narrow beam. The flame burned longer than a standard candle flame would have, and far more efficiently. He evaluated the burn pattern, studying the way the resin melted and how the coil absorbed heat. He adjusted the lantern slightly, lifting one corner to create airflow underneath. As air passed through the small gap, the flame sharpened and gained intensity. He sat back and nodded, satisfied. One lantern was complete, but he was far from finished. He immediately began constructing a second lantern, this time experimenting with a different shape. He chose a circular frame made from bent grass stalks, weaving cords around them to form a ring. He built a smaller resin pocket at the center, reinforced with powdered wood from the stump to extend burn time. He added 2 thin mineral flakes inside the frame, placing them at opposing angles so the flame would split into 2 reflections, magnifying brightness within the ring. He shaved more wax from the candle to seal gaps and used plant fibers to strengthen the outer edges. This lantern required a more controlled wick, so he extracted another tiny piece from the candle's base. He embedded it carefully into the resin cup and then tested the airflow by waving his hand over the top. The structure held firm. He sparked the coil and resin using the mineral flakes again, and the flame caught even faster than before. This lantern glowed with a wide, warm circle of light, softer than the first, but capable of illuminating a broad area. He placed both lanterns side by side to compare brightness and stability. The triangular lantern provided concentrated directional light, perfect for guiding movement or focusing visibility in one direction. The circular lantern produced ambient light, helpful for illuminating surroundings or marking a safe zone. Now he needed ignition tools. He took 2 mineral flakes with jagged edges and bound them together with reinforced cords, making a simple striker that allowed him to create sparks without fumbling for loose stones. He then created a second version using a stick as a handle, embedding 1 flake at the end and sharpening its angle for improved spark production. He tested the striker against a piece of bark coated in wax. The spark ignited the wax immediately, proving the tool's effectiveness. He crafted a third fire starter by wrapping a coil of dry fibers around a stick, coating the tip with powdered resin. When struck, the resin would erupt into a brief but intense flash capable of igniting larger materials. He tested it only once, letting it spark briefly before extinguishing it with his fingers. The flash was powerful enough to ignite even damp fibers if needed. With the lanterns burning steadily and the fire starters lined neatly beside him, Aaron stepped back and surveyed his work. The soft glow illuminated the surrounding rock, pushing the darkness away from the edges of the outcrop. The night no longer felt oppressive. It felt like a blank canvas slowly being reshaped. He was not yet finished, but he had crossed an important threshold. He had turned one candle into the foundation of a lighting system. He had tools to ignite, structures to support flames, and materials to expand as needed. The instructors had given a restriction. Aaron had turned it into an opportunity. Now he had to scale it. Aaron watched the two lanterns burn with steady confidence, their glow cutting a clean boundary between the illuminated stone beneath him and the suffocating dark beyond. The night air had grown colder, and the mist creeping along the lower terrain had thickened into long, drifting tendrils that curled like fingers searching for heat. He knew the predators lurking in the distance would begin moving soon, driven by instinct to investigate any shift in temperature or sound. That meant he needed to fortify his surroundings before the mist rose higher. His lanterns were only the beginning. A true defensive perimeter would require not just light, but layered systems that communicated threat and controlled the environment. He crouched and examined the materials he had left: resin clumps, mineral flakes, grass cords, remnants of bark, and hardened wax from earlier shavings. All of it had purpose, and none of it could be wasted. He started by taking the triangular lantern and positioning it at the western edge of the outcrop, where the rock sloped downward into a narrow ravine. He placed the lantern on a small cluster of stones to elevate it, adjusting the frame until the mineral reflector cast a tight beam toward the ravine entrance. The beam cut across the mist and created a visible channel of light that revealed movement patterns far earlier than darkness would. He stabilized the lantern base with wax pressed into the gaps between the stones and stepped back to assess the coverage. The beam illuminated the thickening mist in ripples, almost like a second set of eyes. That was precisely what he needed. Next, he lifted the circular lantern and carried it to the eastern side of the outcrop, where the terrain opened into a shallow plain. The plain was dangerous because the lack of obstacles meant sound traveled unpredictably, and predators could approach without warning. He set the lantern atop a flat stone and reinforced its edges with resin, creating a slow-melting seal that would harden into an anchor. The lantern's gentle glow spread out in a wide halo, painting the plain in a warm, flickering circle. With two opposite directions secured, Aaron began planning the rest of the perimeter. He gathered several sticks and bark pieces, arranging them into small bundles that resembled crude torches. But instead of lighting them, he coated the tips with resin powder mixed with wax flakes. This mixture would not burn on its own. Instead, it would smolder when exposed to heat, producing a steady trail of smoke without igniting into a flame. Smoke was crucial for mapping airflow. If he placed these bundles correctly, he could read wind currents and detect movement from several meters away before anything reached him. He positioned the first smoke bundle near the northern edge of the outcrop, pressing it into a crack where rising heat from the lanterns would eventually drift. He then placed more bundles at equal intervals, creating a semicircle that mirrored the terrain's shape. Once he activated the heat pockets later, the bundles would release thin plumes of smoke. If anything disturbed those plumes, he would see the distortion instantly. With the smoke markers arranged, Aaron moved on to the alarm traps. He took cords he had braided earlier and tied tiny mineral flakes to the ends. Then he stretched the cords between natural anchors in the stone, crevices, protruding rocks, and loops formed by twisted roots. The result was a network of tension-triggered lines. If something walked through one of the cords, the mineral flakes would snap against each other, creating a burst of sparks. Those sparks alone were bright enough to alert him, but he planned to enhance the effect. He scraped resin dust along the base of each cord, forming a thin powder trail. When the sparks landed in the trail, the powder would flare briefly, creating a visible flash even from the far side of the outcrop. He tested one trap by plucking the cord lightly with his finger. The mineral flakes struck each other and emitted a quick spark. The resin dust ignited into a tiny flare, exactly as he intended. He smiled subtly and reset the trap. The instructors had intended for the cadets to ration a single candle throughout the night, but he had somehow created a defensive network capable of signaling, illuminating, and controlling the flow of approaching movement. He continued working, building a second layer of traps farther out from the lanterns. These ones were simpler. Thin fibers stretched low across the ground, coated with wax for durability. When pulled, the fibers would snap back and strike resin-coated stones, producing dull but distinct cracking sounds. The noise would travel inward and alert him even faster than the sparks would. He placed these sound traps carefully, forming a staggered arc that forced anything moving toward him to trip over at least one. As he finished the sound traps, the mist finally reached the outcrop. It swirled around the stone edges and rose in soft waves. Aaron stepped into the mist deliberately, watching how it reacted to his movement. The mist curled around his legs, rising slightly in response to his body heat before settling again. This behavior confirmed the movement pattern he needed. He returned to his lanterns and increased airflow beneath the triangular one by lifting its frame with another stone. The flame sharpened, and the light beam cut deeper into the mist, revealing faint glimmers of movement far beyond the ridge. Those movements were distant, but real. He did not tense. He only adjusted the lantern again. Now he needed to activate the smoke bundles. He took one of his fire starters and struck it against a mineral flake. The resin-coated tip flashed with a controlled burst, and he used that flash to heat the air pocket under the first smoke bundle. Within seconds, the powder at the bundle's core began to smolder, releasing a thin, steady plume of gray smoke. He repeated this process for the other bundles, weaving between the traps without disturbing any of the tension cords. Soon, a line of soft smoke rose along the northern perimeter. The plumes lifted slowly at first, then drifted sideways as the wind pushed through the valley. Aaron watched the movement. Several plumes bent sharply to the right. That meant an irregular pocket of air pressure. He tracked its origin and saw that the mist near the eastern plain rippled unnaturally. Something was moving there, pacing slowly, testing the air. The predator was not close, but it had begun its approach. Aaron adjusted the circular lantern by tilting its mineral flakes inward, increasing brightness in the direction of the disturbance. The halo of light shifted and illuminated a deeper patch of mist. The movement inside the mist paused, then retreated. The creature understood the fire and recognized that the illuminated area no longer offered an easy path. The perimeter worked. He continued strengthening the defenses, building additional resin pockets along the ground. He shaped the resin into thin lines leading away from the lanterns, creating burn channels that he could ignite later if he needed to redirect predators. He placed bark coated in wax near the western ravine, building a miniature barrier that would ignite quickly if the triangular lantern's beam revealed imminent danger. By the time he finished, the entire outcrop resembled a fortified environment rather than a simple survival camp. Smoke plumes traced the wind. Light beams mapped the mist. Hidden traps waited silently. The lanterns burned brightly enough to hold predators at bay, but not so intensely as to attract more. Aaron had achieved balance. He stepped to the center of the outcrop, inhaled the cold air, and listened. Not a single trap had triggered yet. The predators circled but kept their distance. The darkness felt less like a threat now, and more like a force he had reshaped into something predictable. Aaron lowered himself onto a flat stone and rested his hands on his knees. The candle that had once represented the entire challenge now seemed insignificant compared to the defensive system surrounding him. He glanced at the candle, still unused, still whole, and allowed himself a brief moment of quiet satisfaction. The night was far from over, and sunrise still felt distant, but he had already turned the impossible assignment into a controlled domain. Now he needed to endure until dawn and adapt to whatever the dark still intended to send his way. The night deepened into its coldest stretch as Aaron remained seated on the flat stone at the center of his perimeter, surrounded by the quiet, disciplined glow of the lanterns he had built. The temperature had fallen sharply, enough to numb exposed skin and stiffen the air itself. Yet he stayed alert. His posture remained steady, his eyes moving between the lantern arcs, the smoke trails, and the tension cords stretched across the ground. The environment around him behaved exactly as he intended, and the meticulous balance he had created allowed him to rest while still perceiving every shift around him. That control was all he needed to outlast the final hours of the night. A faint scraping sound drifted from the east, quiet, methodical, and cautious. He opened his eyes fully and watched the circular lantern's light bend subtly as a shape moved just outside the beam's reach. The mist rippled along the ground in a low wave, rising and falling with the creature's rhythmic steps. He observed the distortions with practiced calm. Whatever wandered near the plane had no interest in charging into the light. It circled, testing boundaries, searching for weakness. Aaron kept his breathing even and waited. The creature moved twice more before retreating, dissolving back into the deeper mist. The system held. Another hour passed, marked only by the soft crackle of resin pockets cooling in the wind and the faint hiss of smoldering smoke bundles. The lanterns continued to burn with reliable strength, each flame behaving exactly as he had engineered it to behave. He checked them individually, lifting a hand to shield the triangular lantern from a sudden gust, adjusting its frame slightly to keep the flame steady. He tapped the circular lantern's base to settle a loose mineral flake. Every adjustment strengthened the perimeter further. He would not let complacency weaken anything now that dawn approached. He paced the outcrop slowly, inspecting each trap, testing a few cords with careful taps, and examining the resin burn channels he had shaped earlier. His movements remained silent. He had long been accustomed to preserving sound discipline during critical hours of darkness. He paused briefly at the western edge near the ravine and scanned the depth of the beam from the triangular lantern. The light created a narrow, unbroken path through the mist. He inhaled deeply, the cold air sharp in his chest but satisfying. The predator activity had waned, and the world had grown quiet. Too quiet, perhaps, but he interpreted the silence not as a threat, but as acknowledgement that his perimeter had dominated the environment completely. Finally, as the faintest hint of blue touched the far horizon, the mist began thinning. The first suggestion of dawn crept over the jagged landscape, and the shadows receded in slow, reluctant retreat. Aaron watched the transition carefully. The creatures of the night moved away from the encroaching light, slipping back into burrows, crevices, and valleys that would shield them from the day. The smoke plumes, still rising from the last traces of smoldering bundles, bent more sharply as the warming air shifted. He moved along the perimeter, extinguishing the smoldering remains of the bundles with soft taps of his foot and collecting the materials so the instructors would not misunderstand his intentions. He always preferred leaving the environment as clean as possible when training ended. As the sun approached the horizon, he finally allowed the lantern flames to die. He pressed resin into the bases to snuff them gently without scattering sparks. The frames cooled quickly in the morning air, and he disassembled them with practiced precision. He placed the mineral flakes in one pile, the resin remnants in another, the cords in a third. Even dismantling felt methodical. He refused to leave the outcrop in disarray. The instructors valued efficiency, and he valued maintaining discipline even when the pressure lifted. By the time the sun crested the hills, coloring the sky in pale gold, Aaron's entire defensive system lay organized neatly beside him. Only the unused candle remained separate, a symbol of what the instructors believed the cadets should rely on, yet something he had never needed to ignite. He picked up the candle, observed its unblemished form, then placed it atop the disassembled materials so it sat plainly visible. The instructors approached in silence. Their boots ground softly against the cold earth as they walked from the shadows into the rising sun. 3 of them formed a semicircle around the outcrop, each looking in a different direction to inspect the remains of his work. One crouched by the extinguished resin pockets, examining the burn pattern with interest. Another approached the tension cords he had left partially in place and flicked one lightly. The mineral flakes struck with a spark, causing her to recoil slightly in surprise before nodding in quiet acknowledgement. The third instructor, the highest ranking among them, studied the precision of his dismantled lanterns, running a gloved hand across the mineral reflectors as if checking for irregularities. None of them spoke. Instead, they let the evidence of his work speak for him. Finally, the lead instructor turned to Erin. Her expression remained neutral, but her eyes revealed the realization she carried, that he had not merely completed the assignment, but had reshaped its meaning. He had expanded a single resource into a complete system, turning scarcity into abundance through creativity, patience, and precision. She gestured toward the candle resting atop his organized components and asked a single question that drifted through the crisp morning air. "You did not use it?" He shook his head once. "I used what the environment provided. The candle was preserved for emergencies." The instructor eyed him with a contemplative stillness. She stepped forward, picked up the candle, and weighed it in her palm. She understood the implication immediately. He had passed the test not by relying on the given tool, but by demonstrating that a true survivalist could operate independently of it. She set the candle down again and walked the perimeter slowly, scanning the traps, the burn channels, the stabilized lantern mounts, and the faint smoke residue still lingering in the morning air. Her silence lasted several minutes, but it did not feel like hesitation. It felt like evaluation. When she returned to him, she placed her hands behind her back and spoke in a tone that carried the authority of someone who rarely gave praise. "The assignment was designed to measure endurance, resourcefulness, and restraint. You turned it into an advanced demonstration of environmental control. You created systems where most cadets struggled to preserve a flame." She paused. "You also demonstrated the discipline to dismantle the systems before leaving the site. That consideration matters." The other 2 instructors exchanged brief glances. It was clear they had reached a consensus. The lead instructor continued. "The test was not about surviving with a candle. It was about proving that you understood survival as a system rather than a single tool. You exceeded the parameters." Erin did not respond immediately. He only bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement. He did not need applause or extended praise. He understood the value of the moment without it. The instructor concluded, "The instructors of future cycles will study your methods. Your results will be archived as exemplary performance. For today, the trial ends. You may return to the academy grounds." Erin gathered his materials, leaving the environment restored. As he walked toward the rising sun, the cold receded, and the mist dissolved behind him. The remains of his perimeter glinted faintly until the sunlight overtook them completely. The night had offered challenge, danger, and uncertainty, but he had reshaped it through knowledge, patience, and innovation. The candle had been presented as